What's up guys, Shindig here. With the release of Phase 2 in Season of Discovery, my guild and I power leveled to 40 and recently cleared through the full Gnomeregan raid. I have the full unedited VOD up on my channel right now, but since there's little known about the raid at this point, I wanted to put together an early boss guide to share what I've learned so far. I hope it helps, so let's jump right in. So the first boss you'll face in here is the Trogg boss Grubbis and his pet dog. To get here, go left to the entrance and then left once more. This fight begins with waves of Troggs that try to ambush your team. These aren't too difficult to deal with. Periodically, these green poison clouds will spawn and fixate on someone. They move very slowly, so they aren't especially dangerous, but the only way to get rid of them is by cutting the Troggs into the cloud. Doing so will also instantly kill the ads. After some time, Grubbis and his sidekick will spawn. We had one take on Grubbis and one on Chomper. I don't think it matters which order you kill them in, but we opted to kill the boss first and take the dog off to the side. Grubbis himself has a few abilities. One is called Radiation, which is essentially a reverse frontal. The boss will also periodically enrage himself, doing increased physical damage. He does a raid-wide damage event called Grubbis Mad. It doesn't seem to hit too hard, but make sure your group is topped off going into it. Otherwise, the poison clouds and ads will continue to spawn while Grubbis is active. We had the off-tank pick up the ads and drag them through the poison clouds. Note that you can ignore these clouds, but they seem to last indefinitely and more will spawn. We end up killing the boss with 2 clouds up. Moving on, backtracking out of the cave, you can either jump off the platform, which brings you to the second boss, or continue around the platform, go left to the next door, and right down the ramp, which brings you to like the main hub of the dungeon. Coming here gets you access to a portal which you can use to traverse around a bit easier. Continue forward and you'll arrive at the second boss, Viscous Fallout. This boss only does a couple things. Firstly, it will occasionally spawn green clouds under it that the tank and melee will need to move out of. And secondly, 15 seconds into the fight, and every minute afterwards, 3 goo-looking ads will spawn. Try to nuke these ads down as fast as possible. If you don't, after about 8 to 10 seconds, they will transform into a desiccated Fallout. These elementals have a pretty nasty AoE cast that deals increasing damage with each successive cast, but can be interrupted. Focus these ads down before swapping back to the boss. And that's it. Manage the ads, move out of the green clouds on the ground, and that's the fight. Head west out of this room and go right once you arrive at the launch bay. Wrap around this section until you find a path to the center of the room and the third boss. Crowd Pummeler 960, or the third boss, has a frontal which targets a random player. If caught, it sends you off the platform, so be sure to avoid it. The boss will also spawn gears that move around the room. Getting hit by these won't kill you, but they will bounce you around. It seems like the boss spawns more of these gears the longer the fight progresses. Then lastly, towards the end of the fight, the boss will use an ability called the Claw. I'm not entirely sure how this mechanic works, but it seems to target a random player and do big damn. So, if you're targeted by this mechanic, try to use some sort of defensive, or at the very least, make sure you're topped off going into it. After the fight, go back down the ramp, take a left, then hang a right at the opening, and you'll follow the path until the fork where you'll take a left. Follow this path until you find a lift to the right. Take the lift down and you've made it to Electrocutioner 6000, the 4th boss in the raid. The first and most important mechanic this boss has is called Static Arc. The boss will target the furthest player from its location and deal heavy damage to its target and the 2 nearest players. This ability also leaves a debuff that increases the damage you take from Static Arc by 500%. The debuff lasts 20 seconds and Static Arc goes out every 15 seconds, which means the same 3 players cannot take this ability 2 times in a row. So what we did is have 2 teams of 3 people that would alternate running to and from the boss to soak this hit. Next, the boss will target a random player with Static Field. This person needs to stand out on their own while they have this debuff. If they don't, it will draw players in and deal damage every 2.5 seconds. But be careful not to stand further away from the boss than the players soaking Static Charge, because you can be targeted by Static Arc if you're the furthest player away. Lastly, the boss has a raid-wide knockback it will use every 30 seconds or so. And that's the fight. After defeating the Electrocutioner, head down the narrow hallway and take a left down the ramp. This takes you to the final 2 bosses, but note there is a patrolling mini-boss called the Dark Iron Ambassador that patrols on the opposite side of the corridor. Killing it yields some grime-encrusted salvage. Looking on to the 5th boss, we face the mechanical Menagerie. There are 4 unique bosses for this encounter, 3 of which need to be tanked, and 1 will fixate on and slowly move towards a random player. We ran 2 tanks and 3 healers for this fight, but other combinations of tanks and healers are definitely viable. We had 1 tank on the chicken and the other tank on the dragon and squirrel. The chicken hits very hard, so we found that dividing our tanks this way splits the tank damage pretty evenly. The sheep then will kind of wander around and move towards players. It doesn't follow a standard threat table, so for the most part, we'll just kind of ignore it. With that out of the way, let's talk about what each of these bosses do, and then I'll cover the general strategy we use to take this boss down. Starting with the chicken. It will occasionally spawn explosive eggs at its location. You can DPS these eggs down, but we found it most effective to kite away from them, because if left untouched, eventually they will despawn. If you run too close to one of these eggs, it will explode for a good chunk of your health. The chicken will also periodically use Cluck, buffing itself and the other boss's attack speed by 50%. Next, we have the dragon. Roughly every 25 seconds, it will use Sprocket Fire Breath. This is a frontal that targets a random player, and if hit, leaves a stacking dot that deals fire damage over time. And then there's the squirrel. It uses Widget Volley, which targets a random player, dealing moderate damage and interrupting your cast. But if your raid has an interrupt, you can actually interrupt this cast to prevent the volley from going out. The squirrel may also use Widget Fortress. This applies a damage reduction to the bosses, so as a tank, be sure to drag them out of it. Finally, we have the sheep. This boss kinda just does its own thing. It will slowly move towards players some of the time, and then just stand still some of the time. Its only noteworthy mechanics are Static Fleece. This is a Thorns type ability that has a chance to stun attackers, but only seems to affect players in melee range, and Frayed Wiring, which works the same as the Lightning Totem in BFD, dealing reflect damage back to any players that attack it while buffed. That's it for each of the boss's major unique mechanics. As an aside, I'll add that there are a couple abilities like Binary Bleat and Slag Embers that either don't seem to be working, or I don't understand how they work. If you have any ideas, drop a comment below, and once I know more, I'll update the description of this guide. Then between the 4 of them, they can overheat. While affected by overheat, bosses take 25% increased damage, but deal heavy damage to anyone within melee range. The simplest solution here is to have your melee run out until the overheat ends. So with that out of the way, here's what we did to kill the boss. Our tanks and melee worked their way in a circle around the room, moving as needed for various mechanics. Ranged and healers were positioned in the middle, melee focused down the 3 tankable bosses, while casters worked on the sheep. Avoid the dragon's breath, move out for overheat, and don't attack the sheep during its reflect. Additionally, all 4 bosses need to die at the same time. If they aren't finished off within 20 seconds of each other, they'll repair back to 30% health. Once the encounter is finished, the 6th and final boss, Mekgneer Thermaplugg, will spawn, and the fight will begin. This is a long, 4-phase encounter. We'll cover each of the phases shortly, but we should start with the main mechanic for this fight, which involves handling the spawning bombs. In all phases, any of the 6 pillars may become active and begin spewing out bombs which fixate and move towards players. If they reach their target, they explode and do some type of effect, depending on the phase you're in. The bombs don't have a lot of health, and most classes can take them out in a single hit, but to stop them from spawning, somebody needs to interact with the red button on the pillar. Doing so will deal damage to you, restore mana, and apply a debuff that prevents you from pressing another button for 30 seconds. This means if a new pillar becomes active before the debuff expires, somebody else will need to press the button. What we found worked best was to have 3 players, preferably ranged or healers, responsible for hitting buttons and dealing with the bombs. You can probably get away with assigning 2 people to this role, but we found it more reliable having 3 for reasons I'll get into later. And make sure you stand still for a second when pressing the button. It seems like if you move immediately after pressing, it doesn't register the press, so post up for a sec and then you'll be good to go. Alright, let's talk about phase 1, the fire phase. In this phase, when a bomb explodes, it will leave a patch of scorched ground. This variant is probably the easiest to deal with because the ground effect does damage to you and nothing else. Otherwise, during this phase, the boss will do two things. Firstly, it applies Sprocket Fire, a stacking dot to the active tank. This is a taunt swap mechanic for the phase. An off tank should taunt off when the active tank stacks get too high. Secondly, it will use Furnace Surge on the active tank. This ability has a 3-second cast time and will rapidly apply stacks of Sprocket Fire, if the tank is within melee range of the boss. So the strat here is to have the active tank run away during the cast, such that they avoid taking most of, if not all stacks that would come from this ability. We opted to position towards the far edge of the room, so our tanks had space to kite the boss without needing to worry about bombs. At 50% health, you'll enter the first phase transition and will have about 20 seconds of downtime before starting phase 2. The boss returns back to full health, but now everything in the room deals frost damage, and that damage applies stacks of freezing. Like phase 1, the boss applies stacks of this debuff to the main tank. Each stack of freezing is a 5% slow. At 11 stacks, the player will be frozen solid. Additionally, bombs now apply stacks of freezing, and the boss uses Coolant Discharge every 25 seconds, a raid-wide AoE hit that also applies a stack. The good news is that this debuff can be dispelled, and some classes have ways to drop their debuff. For example, because freezing is a slow, druids can shapeshift out of it. Free action potions are also quite strong in this fight since they prevent the application of new stacks. And even if somebody builds up to 11 stacks and is frozen solid, the freeze itself can be dispelled. But if the boss happens to use Coolant Discharge while somebody's frozen, it's a raid wipe mechanic. For positioning, what worked for us this phase, and for the rest of the fight, was to tank the boss in the middle of the room, with 3 players in charge of bombs assigned to 2 pillars each. And if ever we had the debuff with one of the pillars active, one of the melee DPS would run over and cover for us. Once brought to 50% health, the boss enters the second phase transition, once again becoming inactive for a period before returning back to full health and beginning the third or nature phase. This phase proceeds similar to the previous phase, but the new debuff for the phase is a disease, which is applied to the tank and players hit by bombs, but like the freezing debuff, can also be dispelled. Then, instead of Coolant Discharge, the boss gains Toxic Ventilation. This is a channeled ability that deals raid-wide damage, but can be interrupted, despite the fact there is no cast bar. Bring the boss once again to 50% health, and you'll enter the third and final phase transition before the boss ascends to its ultimate form and phase 4 begins. In this stage, the boss has less health, but gains access to all abilities used in the previous 3 phases. And the bombs that spawn will now be of varying types. Nothing major changes here, just combine what you've learned during the past 3 phases and bring the boss down. Once you've brought STX 99XD to 0% health, Mekgneer Thermaplugg will become vulnerable. After you've given him a good smackdown, the fight ends. Which also rounds out the end of this guide. Congratulations on getting through the raid, collect your loot, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.